Sarah Bennett's life was the envy of her small Indiana community. Her home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, was a sanctuary of warmth and love. Her marriage to Mark, a hardworking and dependable man, seemed unshakable, and together they raised Sarah's bright and beautiful 16-year-old daughter from a previous relationship, Chloe. For a decade, Sarah had believed her family was unbreakable, a beacon of stability and trust. But beneath the surface of her idyllic life, dark secrets festered, unraveling everything Sarah thought she knew. One fateful night, those secrets would erupt, leaving her family shattered and their home stained with the unthinkable. What happens when trust is not only betrayed but obliterated in the most horrific way? Sarah's story is more than a tale of infidelity, it's a chilling exploration of manipulation, heartbreak, and the devastating consequences of one shocking revelation. What began as a life of love and commitment became a harrowing journey into betrayal and rage, culminating in an act of violence that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. Before we unravel this shocking tale, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Crime Chronicles. Here, we explore the darkest corners of human behavior and bring you stories that will keep you glued to your screen. Let's dive in. Sarah and Mark Bennett had built a life that seemed lifted straight from the pages of a family magazine. For 10 years, they had been the embodiment of a strong, stable marriage, the kind people in their quiet Indiana neighborhood looked up to. Sarah, ever the devoted homemaker, poured her energy into creating a warm, inviting home. Every detail, from the flower beds lining their front yard to the smell of fresh-baked cookies that often wafted from the kitchen, reflected her dedication to her family. Mark, a diligent and respected contractor, worked long hours to provide for them, often coming home exhausted but with a smile that spoke of his pride in the life they'd built together. At the center of this seemingly perfect picture was 16-year-old Chloe, Sarah's daughter from a previous relationship. Though Chloe wasn't Mark's biological child, he had stepped into the role of father figure without hesitation when she was just a little girl. Over the years, he had attended her school plays, helped her with homework, and even taught her how to ride a bike. To outsiders, the bond between Mark and Chloe was heartwarming, a testament to the strength of blended families. Together, the three of them presented an image of harmony. Their family dinners were often filled with laughter and shared stories about their days. On weekends, they could be found attending local events, hosting barbecues for their neighbors, or taking trips to nearby parks. Chloe would frequently gush about how grateful she was to have Mark in her life, while Sarah would smile, proud of the family she had worked so hard to nurture. Friends and neighbors admired the Bennetts. They were the kind of family people pointed to as an example of how love and dedication could create something beautiful. Mark was often praised for being a stand-up guy, someone who treated Chloe as if she were his own, while Sarah was known for her generosity and kindness. Their home was more than a house, it was a gathering place where others felt welcomed, a beacon of stability in an often chaotic world. To anyone looking in from the outside, the Bennetts had it all. They were a family grounded in love and trust, a reminder that happiness was possible with the right people by your side. But as with many picture-perfect facades, the truth of their lives was far more complex, and beneath the surface of their idyllic world, cracks were beginning to form. Cracks that no one, not their friends, their neighbors, or even Sarah herself, could have anticipated. Sarah had spent weeks planning the perfect surprise for their 10th wedding anniversary. She wanted to bring back the spark that had dulled in recent years. With a beautifully wrapped gift in one hand and a bouquet of Mark's favorite flowers in the other, Sarah returned home earlier than usual, her heart racing with excitement. The soft hum of music from the living room greeted her as she pushed open the front door, a wide smile on her face as she called out to her husband and daughter. But the sight that met her eyes froze her in place. Mark was not alone on the couch. Chloe was with him, her legs draped across his lap, their bodies entangled in a way that was unmistakably intimate. The air seemed to be sucked out of the room as Sarah's brain struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. The bouquet slipped from her trembling hands, landing on the floor with a muted thud. Mark?" Sarah's voice cracked, her words more a gasp than a question. She took a faltering step forward, her eyes darting between them, desperate for an explanation that might make this horrifying image less real. Mark and Chloe leapt apart, their faces pale with shock. Mark was the first to recover, standing and holding up his hands as if to calm her. "Sarah, it's not what it looks like," he stammered, his voice unsteady but laced with an infuriating edge of defensiveness. "Not what it looks like?" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking with disbelief. "I walked into this. What else could it possibly be?" Chloe, sitting frozen on the couch, pulled her knees to her chest, her eyes filled with tears but fixed firmly on the floor. She said nothing, her silence screaming louder than any words could have. The room seemed to tilt as the weight of realization crashed down on Sarah. This wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment. This was a betrayal that had been unfolding right under her nose. Mark's tone shifted, his words sharp and dismissive. "Look, Sarah, you're overreacting. This isn't as bad as you think." His casual dismissal, as though he had been caught in nothing more serious than a white lie, sent Sarah's emotions into overdrive. "Overreacting?" Her voice rose, a mix of incredulity and fury. "You're sleeping with my 16-year-old daughter." Mark's gaze hardened, his defensiveness morphing into frustration. "You don't understand, Sarah. Chloe and I dash." "Don't you dare," Sarah spat, cutting him off. She turned her attention to Chloe, her voice trembling. "Chloe, please, say something. Tell me he's lying." But Chloe didn't look up. Her tears fell silently, her hands twisting in her lap. Her inability or unwillingness to speak felt like a knife to Sarah's chest. "How long?" Sarah demanded, her voice now icy and low as she turned back to Mark. "How long has this been going on?" Mark hesitated for a fraction of a second, but the pause was enough. Sarah's world crumbled in that moment, the betrayal too massive to comprehend. Every shared moment, every touch, every family memory now felt tainted, corrupted by this sickening secret. Her legs felt weak, and she clutched the back of a chair to steady herself. Her gaze darted around the room, taking in the cozy living space that had once been her sanctuary. The family photos on the mantel now seemed grotesque, mocking her with their lies. The room was heavy with tension, the silence broken only by Sarah's ragged breathing. Mark took a step toward her, reaching out as if to placate her. But Sarah stepped back, her eyes blazing with anger and heartbreak. "Don't you dare come near me," she hissed, her voice venomous. The betrayal wasn't just an affair. It was a desecration of everything Sarah held dear: her marriage, her family, and her trust. The man she loved, the father figure she had trusted with her daughter, had destroyed their lives with his unforgivable actions. The tension in the room was suffocating as the argument between Sarah, Mark, and Chloe escalated. Sarah was consumed by a volatile mix of rage, disbelief, and heartbreak. She demanded to know how long this betrayal had been going on, her voice raw and frantic, but Mark's answers were maddeningly evasive. He tried to justify his actions, telling her that things weren't as bad as she thought, that it had just happened, but his excuses only deepened the wound. Chloe remained silent, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She couldn't meet Sarah's gaze, her body trembling in fear and guilt. Every word Sarah spoke was like a slap, but Chloe couldn't find her voice. The weight of the situation crushed her, as if the air in the room was being slowly sucked away. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and the sharp sting of betrayal cut deeper with every attempt Mark made to excuse himself. How could he do this to me? How could he do this to her? The questions kept swirling in her mind, but nothing could fill the chasm of devastation growing inside her. As Mark approached her, his tone shifting from defensive to condescending, Sarah snapped. Her hands were shaking, her pulse racing with adrenaline. In the midst of the chaos, her eyes landed on the brass fireplace poker resting against the hearth. It gleamed in the dim light, a cold, solid object that seemed to call to her in that moment, a symbol of the violence that now raged within her. Before she could stop herself, her hand reached out, seizing the poker. She held it with both hands, feeling the weight of it in her palms. Mark was coming toward her, his face twisted in annoyance, his words still dripping with condescension. How dare he? She thought, and in that split second, every ounce of pain, betrayal, and fury exploded. Without thinking, she swung the poker at Mark with all her strength. The blow landed with a sickening thud against the side of his head. Mark staggered backward, his eyes wide in shock, but it was too late. The moment the poker made contact, all rational thought was lost to the red haze of Sarah's rage. As Mark stumbled, clutching his head in stunned disbelief, Sarah swung the poker again. This time, the blow landed squarely at the base of his skull, the force of it sending him crumpling to the floor. The sound of his body hitting the ground was sickeningly final, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Chloe screamed, her voice piercing the air as she watched her mother stand over Mark's lifeless body. The horror on her face was mirrored in Sarah's eyes as she looked down at what she had just done. Blood pooled around Mark's head, and the room was filled with an eerie, suffocating silence. The violent act had happened so quickly, and now Sarah was frozen in place, her hands trembling as the weight of what she had done settled upon her. I killed him, she thought, her mind reeling in disbelief. The rage that had driven her just moments before was now replaced by an overwhelming sense of guilt and horror. The anger that had propelled her forward was gone, and in its place was a deep, nauseating emptiness. Chloe stood paralyzed, her sobs uncontrollable as she stared at the bloody scene before her. The mother she had once trusted, the father figure she had loved, both were now irreparably shattered. There was no going back. In a daze, Sarah stumbled toward the phone, her hands slick with blood as she dialed 911. Her voice was frantic and broken as she sobbed, I killed him. I didn't mean to, he betrayed us. Please help. The 911 operator's voice was distant, almost a blur, as Sarah's world spun out of control. She could barely process what she was saying, the words slipping from her mouth in a disjointed, frantic stream. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they neared the house. When the police arrived, they found a scene of complete chaos. Sarah stood by the door, her clothes soaked in blood, her face pale and streaked with tears. Chloe was curled up on the couch, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking uncontrollably. The officers stepped into the room cautiously, taking in the grisly scene. Mark's body sprawled on the floor, his lifeless eyes staring up at nothing. The fireplace poker, still covered in blood, lay discarded beside him. It was clear that this was no accident, no momentary lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate, violent act born from overwhelming emotions and a broken family. Sarah didn't resist as she was handcuffed, her body limp as the reality of what had just happened hit her. All she could think about was the face of her daughter, the unbearable guilt gnawing at her insides. There would be no going back now. The man she had loved, the father figure she had trusted, he was gone, and with him, the fragile semblance of the life they once shared. As the investigation began, the police worked quickly to piece together the events leading up to Mark's brutal death. Investigators uncovered a chilling trail of messages between Mark and Chloe, messages that were laden with manipulation and coercion. It became clear that Mark had been grooming Chloe for months, exploiting her vulnerability and emotionally manipulating her into an illicit relationship. These messages painted a picture of a toxic, controlling relationship where Chloe had been manipulated into something she was too young and naive to fully understand. Chloe, in a state of shock and guilt, reluctantly agreed to testify. In a tearful, heartbreaking recounting of events, she detailed how Mark had used his authority as a father figure to emotionally control her, making her believe that their secret affair was something they both needed. Her testimony revealed the months of manipulation and abuse, describing how Mark had preyed on her weaknesses and gradually isolated her from Sarah. She spoke of her inner turmoil, how she had struggled to make sense of the betrayal but had been too afraid to speak out. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Chloe described the manipulative nature of their relationship, with many jurors visibly shaken by the emotional toll it had taken on her. The defense team argued that Sarah's actions were the result of an overwhelming emotional response to the devastating betrayal she had witnessed. They contended that Sarah, as a mother, had been pushed to the breaking point after learning of Mark's manipulation of her daughter. The defense highlighted how Sarah's rage was fueled not only by the betrayal of her marriage but by the realization that Mark had taken advantage of her daughter. Sarah's attorney painted her as a mother who had acted out of a desire to protect her daughter, not out of malice. In their view, Sarah's actions were an act of desperation, a mother's instinct to defend her child from further harm. The prosecution, however, argued that while the circumstances surrounding the crime were deeply emotional, Sarah's actions were deliberate and unjustifiable. They pointed to the fact that Sarah had taken time to grab the fireplace poker before attacking Mark, suggesting that the act was not purely impulsive. They also emphasized that, while Mark's actions were reprehensible, Sarah had crossed a line by taking matters into her own hands. The prosecution argued that Sarah's response to the betrayal, while understandable on some level, was an act of violence that could not be excused by the emotional circumstances. After a tense trial, the jury deliberated for several days. They acknowledged the emotional weight of the crime, understanding the depth of betrayal Sarah had suffered. However, they also weighed the brutal nature of Mark's death and the fact that Sarah's actions were not entirely impulsive. Ultimately, the jury found Sarah guilty of voluntary manslaughter, rather than murder, recognizing the overwhelming emotional strain she had been under, but also acknowledging that her response had been extreme. Sarah was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 8 years. While the verdict brought some closure to the case, it did little to ease the scars left on Sarah, Chloe, and their community. For Chloe, the trial was another painful reminder of the twisted web of deceit that had torn apart her family. The guilt she felt over her own role in the affair, coupled with the trauma of the events that had unfolded, weighed heavily on her. As for Sarah, the conviction brought little relief. While she had avoided a murder conviction, the emotional toll of her actions was something she would carry for the rest of her life. The story of Sarah, Mark, and Chloe left a lasting impact on the community, with many grappling with the complexities of family, betrayal, and the consequences of unchecked emotions. The courtroom felt heavy with the weight of the verdict, but Sarah's emotions remained unreadable. Though the jury had acknowledged the emotional strain she had been under, the brutal nature of Mark's death left little room for complete leniency. As she was led away, she cast a long, lingering glance toward Chloe, who sat quietly, unable to meet her mother's eyes. It was a moment that encapsulated the profound fracture in their relationship, a bond that had once been built on love and trust, now shattered beyond repair. Chloe, who is just 16, in the aftermath of the trial, was left to pick up the pieces of her own life. The guilt she felt was suffocating. Though she had been the victim of Mark's manipulation, her role in the affair had torn her apart. The trauma of witnessing her mother's violent outburst, and the loss of both her mother and her stepfather, sent Chloe into a deep emotional spiral. She struggled to reconcile her grief over Mark's death with the guilt of her involvement in his actions. As she sought counseling, Chloe worked through the complex emotions of being manipulated, betrayed, and ultimately abandoned by both her mother and the man who had once been a father figure to her. The journey to healing would be long and difficult, as she was left grappling with not only the loss of her family but also the burden of the choices they had all made. Sarah's extended family stepped in to provide support for Chloe, but the emotional scars of the betrayal and violence were too deep to be healed easily. Relatives tried to offer a semblance of normalcy, but the tension in their home was palpable. Chloe found herself alienated, her mind constantly drifting back to that horrific night and the family she had lost. Even with their support, the damage had been done. The legacy of that night would forever hang over them, a painful reminder of how fragile familial bonds could be and how deeply betrayal could wound. The community, too, struggled to make sense of the tragedy. Sarah had been a respected figure, a woman everyone believed to have a strong moral compass. Her actions shocked everyone who had known her, leaving many to question the limits of forgiveness and the complexities of familial love. How could someone who had once embodied trust and justice commit such a devastating betrayal? It was a question that would linger in the minds of many long after the trial ended, as the community reeled from the revelation that even the closest, most seemingly perfect families can fall apart when trust is broken beyond repair. In the end, the crime left no one untouched. Chloe would continue to battle with the aftermath for years, and Sarah would serve her sentence in prison, haunted by the destruction she had caused. Their story was a stark reminder of the fragility of family ties and the devastating consequences of betrayal, a tale that would continue to haunt the hearts of those involved for the rest of their lives. Sarah's story is a haunting reminder of the devastating consequences of betrayal. In the end, her desire for love and trust was overshadowed by the darkest depths of deception and rage. What started as a picture-perfect life crumbled into a nightmare, leaving a trail of broken hearts, shattered relations. Family forever scarred. The events that unfolded that night were a result of a web of manipulation, grief, and emotional devastation, all of which led to a crime that no one could have predicted. Could Sarah's actions have been prevented, or was she pushed to the breaking point? What would you have done in her situation? It's impossible to say for sure, but it's clear that the consequences of betrayal can be far-reaching, sometimes leading even the most stable individuals down a dark path of irreversible decisions. Thank you for joining us for this harrowing tale of betrayal and justice. Don't forget to like, subscribe to Crime Chronicles and stay tuned for more true crime stories that expose the deepest cracks in human relationships.